The air in the Oval Office crackled with tension, the weight of the political moment pressing down on everyone in the room. President Donald Trump, seated at the resolute desk, his eyes narrowed, watched the replay of Ilhan Omar's teletown hall on the massive screen in front of him. The footage, carefully clipped and amplified by left-wing media, carried her voice across the room with unmistakable urgency. She was painting a dire picture of the Republican budget cuts, focusing particularly on Medicaid, spinning it as a ruthless assault on the most vulnerable in society. Trump, ever the tactician, reached for the remote and paused the footage, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the desk. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "She's good, I'll give her that," he said finally, his tone laced with both irritation and begrudging acknowledgement. Good at twisting the truth, that is. Playing the victim, stirring up the base. It's all theater, but it works. He leaned back in his chair, glancing at his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who sat across from him with a tight expression. She had spent the last several days monitoring the media's reaction to Omar's remarks, and it wasn't looking good. "The narrative is gaining traction, Mr. President," Leavitt said, her voice steady but serious. "People are genuinely worried. The media's running with the heartless Republicans slashing Medicaid angle, and it's sticking. The usual networks, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, they're amplifying it, but even some independents are buying in. Our internal polling shows movement among suburban voters, especially younger ones. They hear cuts to Medicaid, and they panic. They don't look at the numbers, just the headlines." Trump frowned, absorbing the information. He prided himself on understanding the media better than anyone, but even he knew that once a narrative took hold, it was hard to shake. Facts didn't always matter, perception did. And right now, the perception was that Republicans were slashing health care to give tax breaks to the wealthy, a tired but effective Democratic attack. Seated to the side, Representative Chip Roy, the staunch Texan whose no-nonsense approach had made him a conservative firebrand, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in frustration. "With all due respect, Mr. President, we need to push back harder. Spending is out of control. We're drowning in debt. Those cuts she's screeching about are responsible adjustments. We're talking about trimming waste, ending fraud, cutting the fat out of these bloated programs, not pulling health care from seniors and single moms. But no one hears that because they've got a megaphone, and we're whispering." Trump nodded slowly, weighing the argument. Chip Roy was right, of course. The budget was bloated. Medicaid had become an unchecked entitlement rife with inefficiencies and fraud. His administration had worked hard to rein in spending while ensuring that essential services remained intact. But that wasn't what people were hearing. They were hearing Omar and the Democrats frame it as a cold-hearted attack on the poor. He turned back to Leavitt. "What's our countermessage?" Leavitt straightened in her chair, prepared. "We emphasize fiscal responsibility while hammering the Democrats on their own failures. We remind the public that these so-called cuts are necessary to keep programs sustainable. We expose how much waste exists in Medicaid, how billions are being spent on fraud, administrative overhead, and people who aren't even eligible for the program. We highlight success stories, families that benefit from a streamlined system, taxpayers who aren't footing the bill for inefficiency. And we go on offense." Trump arched a brow. "Go on?" Leavitt leaned forward, her confidence growing. "We flip the script. We hit back at Omar and the progressives for their hypocrisy. They scream about cuts while pushing insane levels of spending on student loan bailouts, Green New Deal nonsense, and open border welfare programs that cost way more than anything we've proposed. We remind voters that Democrats have controlled Washington for years, and what did they do? Skyrocketing inflation, an economic downturn, and a national debt that's out of control. If we don't fix this, we're looking at a collapse. That's the real crisis, not a few billion in necessary adjustments to Medicaid." Chip Roy nodded approvingly. "That's the right move. We stop playing defense and start making them own their failures." Trump smirked, a flicker of approval crossing his face. This was what he liked: aggression, counterpunching, taking control of the narrative rather than letting it control them. "All right," he said, nodding. "I want a press blitz. Caroline, coordinate with conservative media, get our message out. Patel," he turned toward Kash Patel, who had been quietly listening, arms folded. "We need numbers. Hard data on Medicaid fraud, wasteful spending, all of it. I want it in my next rally speech." Leavitt and Roy exchanged a glance, understanding that a Trump rally would be the perfect venue to reframe the issue. Trump's base was loyal, but they needed ammunition for their arguments. The mainstream media wasn't going to tell the truth, so they would. Trump exhaled, glancing back at the frozen image of Omar on the screen. She wants to play the victim? Fine. Let's show the American people who the real villains are. Trump steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the conversation unfolding around him. Roy's right, he finally said, his voice measured. But facts alone won't win this fight. People are scared. They need to understand why these changes are necessary, and they need to trust that they won't be abandoned. He let the words hang in the air, knowing full well that a logical argument alone wouldn't be enough to sway public opinion. The Democrats had mastered the art of emotional appeals, and Omar, whether he liked it or not, was effective at stirring up anxiety. That's when Elon Musk, seated a few chairs away, leaned forward, his presence in the meeting unusual but not unwelcome. His mere invitation to the Oval Office was a testament to Trump's willingness to think outside the box, to tap into minds that understood the rapidly evolving information war in ways traditional politicians simply couldn't. Musk wasn't just a billionaire, he was an influencer, a disruptor, and a master of shaping narratives in the modern era. He had built empires on innovation and strategy, and now the former president was looking to harness that expertise in the political battlefield. The problem, Musk stated, his voice calm but firm, is that you're playing on their field. Omar and the progressives are leveraging emotional appeals. If you respond with a standard policy explanation, it's already a losing battle. People don't engage with long-winded rebuttals. They engage with stories. They remember what moves them. You need to cut through the noise, deliver a clear, concise, and, frankly, entertaining counter-narrative. Entertaining? Levitt raised an eyebrow, unsure of where Musk was going with this. Musk nodded. Think memes, short videos, easily digestible data visualizations, he elaborated, his hands gesturing as he spoke. Targeted social media campaigns that expose the flaws in Omar's claims and highlight the long-term benefits of fiscal responsibility. You need to debunk her point by point, but not in a dry, boring way. Make it impossible to ignore. If people feel the truth rather than just hear it, they'll internalize it. You have to make reality more compelling than the fantasy she's selling. Trump's eyes lit up slightly. Musk was speaking his language now. So, we're talking viral content. We hit them where they live. Social media, quick sound bites, memes. He leaned back, his trademark smirk forming. I like it. The left hates humor when it's turned against them. Musk nodded again. Exactly. Satire is powerful. It dismantles bad ideas by making them look ridiculous. You don't just say Omar is wrong, you make it obvious to anyone watching, to the point where people laugh at the idea of taking her seriously. Humor is disarming. If we push out content that's shareable, that people want to spread, we control the conversation. It's about making the truth more viral than the lie. Roy, who had been listening intently, interjected. That's all well and good, but we also need substance. We're not just fighting a meme war. We need people to see the real numbers. Musk didn't flinch. You can do both. We pair viral content with hard data in a way that's impossible to ignore. Infographics that shock people, side-by-side comparisons that make it clear how much waste we're cutting, and more importantly, what Democrats are spending taxpayer money on instead. Levitt, her mind already racing through messaging strategies, nodded slowly. This could work. We control the visuals, the conversation, the emotional weight behind it. Instead of reacting, we dictate the terms. Trump grinned, slamming his palm on the table. Now, that's what I'm talking about. We don't play defense, we go on offense. He turned to Levitt. I want a team working on this immediately. Get our best people on messaging, start crafting the content. And Musk, he looked at the billionaire with a knowing smirk. You think you can help make sure this gets the traction it needs? Musk chuckled. Let's just say I know a few people who can make sure it reaches exactly the right audience. Trump leaned forward, energized. Then let's go. We're about to show them how the real narrative is made. Trump grinned, eyes gleaming with renewed energy. I like the way you think, Elon. We need to go on the offensive. Caroline, I want you to assemble a rapid response team. Chip, you provide the factual ammunition. Elon, you bring the creative firepower. He pointed at each of them in turn, his leadership unmistakable. The time for playing defense was over. They would not allow Omar's misleading narrative to fester unchallenged. This was war, the war of messaging, and Trump knew better than anyone that perception was everything. The plan took shape quickly. Levitt's team got to work first, meticulously fact-checking Omar's claims and exposing the misleading statistics and outright falsehoods she had presented in her teletown hall. They compiled side-by-side comparisons of her statements against actual budget numbers, highlighting the exaggerations and fear-mongering tactics she had used. One particularly damaging revelation was how she had framed a standard budget adjustment as a drastic cut, when in reality the program's spending was increasing, just at a slower rate than the Democrats wanted. The key, Levitt knew, was making this information digestible for the public, breaking it down into simple, undeniable truths. Meanwhile, Chip Roy dug into the hard numbers, providing a detailed breakdown of federal spending. He highlighted the unsustainable levels of debt, the bloated bureaucracy that had siphoned billions away from taxpayers, and the reckless spending that had contributed to inflation. He demonstrated, with irrefutable data, how the so-called cuts were in fact necessary reforms to prevent economic disaster. Roy's analysis wasn't just theoretical. It showed in stark terms how, without fiscal responsibility, the next generation would be saddled with an insurmountable burden. He also emphasized how Democrats had misprioritized taxpayer dollars, spending lavishly on pet projects while fear-mongering about essential services. But the real game-changer was Musk's team. They weren't bound by traditional political messaging. They understood the internet, how attention worked in the modern media landscape, and how to craft content that spread like wildfire. Their approach was simple: make the Democrats' fear-mongering look ridiculous, and make the Republican proposals look like common sense. Musk's digital creatives got to work, crafting short, snappy, viral videos that exposed the hypocrisy of Omar's arguments. They dissected her most inflammatory claims, overlaying them with real numbers, humorous animations, and side-by-side contradictions from her own previous statements. They turned economic principles into engaging, easy-to-understand visuals, memes, infographics, and short-form videos that flooded social media with a counter-narrative that was impossible to ignore. One particularly powerful video, which Musk himself tweeted out to his massive following, opened with Omar solemnly warning about people starving in the streets because of Republican budget cuts. The video then cut to a breakdown of federal spending on unnecessary programs, billions wasted on redundant agencies, overfunded bureaucracies, and special interest handouts, contrasted with the relatively modest Medicaid adjustments. It ended with the question, if Democrats care so much about the poor, why do they always put the government first? The video racked up millions of views in hours, setting the tone for the campaign's messaging. The key, Musk insisted, was to show the public that the budget reforms weren't about hurting vulnerable Americans. They were about ensuring the long-term health of the nation. His team produced a series of crisp, engaging explainer videos breaking down Republican proposals in ways that were digestible and appealing. They illustrated how the proposed changes to the Thrifty Food Plan would actually streamline SNAP benefits, making them more efficient and less prone to waste. They stressed that Medicare was not being gutted, but strengthened through reforms that would extend its solvency rather than allow it to collapse under unchecked expansion. The messaging was clear. The left wanted to make people dependent on government handouts, while the right wanted to create a sustainable, prosperous future. By pairing sharp satire with undeniable facts, Musk and his team ensured that the Republican argument was no longer just being heard, it was being felt. Trump watched the operation unfold with growing satisfaction. This was exactly what he had envisioned, an all-out offensive that didn't just respond to attacks, but completely upended the opposition's narrative. He knew that Omar and the Democrats would double down, but for the first time in years, the Republican message wasn't just fighting back, it was winning. The counteroffensive was executed with precision, launched across multiple platforms in a relentless barrage of tweets, short videos, and visually appealing infographics. The messaging was crafted for maximum impact, quick, digestible, and impossible to ignore. Trump himself took to social media, responding to Ilhan Omar's claims with his characteristic bluntness, calling out her fear-mongering and distortions in a way that was both entertaining and effective. His posts were instantly viral, amplified by his massive following and a network of conservative influencers who had been waiting for a coordinated pushback. But it wasn't just Trump's words that carried weight. The viral videos Musk's team had created gained traction across social media, spreading like wildfire. Clips of Omar's exaggerated claims were juxtaposed with factual breakdowns, exposing her manipulation of statistics. One particularly devastating video, cut between Omar's dire warnings about gutting Medicaid and actual budget reports showing that funding was still increasing, just not at the unchecked rate Democrats wanted. The caption read simply, "Math is hard." The internet loved it. The meme war, once a battleground dominated by the left, was now being fought aggressively from the right, and it was working. Trump took the fight beyond social media, hitting the campaign trail with renewed energy. At packed rallies across the country, he delivered passionate speeches about the importance of fiscal discipline, the need to curb reckless spending, and the responsibility of safeguarding Medicare for future generations. He didn't just attack Omar's claims. He painted a compelling vision of America's future, one where the economy thrived under responsible governance, where families weren't burdened by massive national debt, and where entitlement programs were preserved because they were managed properly, not exploited for political gain. As expected, Omar's response was predictable: accusations of racism, fear-mongering, and attacks on Trump's character. She fell back on the same progressive playbook that had worked in the past, attempting to shift the conversation away from policy and onto identity politics. But this time, something was different. The message didn't resonate as strongly. The public was no longer as easily swayed by emotional appeals alone. They had been armed with facts, presented in a way they could understand and engage with. Instead of taking Omar's words at face value, many Americans began questioning why she was so adamant about misrepresenting the issue. The true turning point came during a nationally televised town hall, moderated by a neutral journalist, an event that became a defining moment in the debate. Trump entered the forum fully prepared, armed with statistics, data, and expert analysis. He had anticipated the attacks and countered them with a level of discipline that caught even his detractors off guard. When Omar repeated her claim that millions would lose health care due to Republican cuts, Trump calmly corrected her. "That's simply false," he said, producing a chart detailing Medicaid spending under both Democratic and Republican leadership. Medicaid is still growing. We are reforming it, making sure it's there for people who truly need it, not for fraud, not for bureaucrats, and not for political games. The only people who lose are the ones who have been exploiting the system. When she accused him of attacking the poor, he responded with a direct challenge. "Ilhan, where was this concern when your party was throwing billions at climate slush funds, student loan bailouts, and special interests? If you cared so much about the working class, why did you prioritize expanding government instead of fixing the economy? Why is it our responsibility to clean up your spending mess?" The audience reaction was palpable. For the first time, Omar found herself on the defensive, struggling to counter the hard numbers presented before her. Trump didn't just expose her manipulation of facts. He dismantled her selective outrage piece by piece. He pointed out how Democrats only seemed to care about deficits when it suited their political narrative. He illustrated how every dollar saved from wasteful spending could be reinvested into programs that actually benefited Americans, rather than bloated government agencies. He didn't argue from a place of cruelty, as Omar had tried to frame it, but from one of strength, a vision of a fiscally responsible America, where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. The moment shifted the entire conversation. Even mainstream media outlets, usually hostile to Trump, were forced to acknowledge that his arguments had landed. Omar had walked into the town hall expecting to control the narrative. Instead, she had become a symbol of everything wrong with Washington's spending addiction. By the time the event ended, it was clear: Trump had won. The American people had seen through the manufactured hysteria. The Republican message, once drowned out by Democratic talking points, was now the conversation. And in the battle of perception, that was everything. The polls shifted, and with them, the momentum of the entire debate. What had once been an uphill battle against a deeply entrenched narrative of fear and uncertainty had transformed into an undeniable wave of support for the Republican proposals. The carefully orchestrated counteroffensive, combining sharp messaging, viral media, and unassailable facts, had done its job. The fear-mongering tactics of the left, once effective in stirring public anxiety, had lost their grip. Instead, a new sentiment had taken hold, one of hope, optimism, and the belief that real reform was possible. The Republican message had resonated where it mattered most, with middle-class families struggling under the weight of economic uncertainty, with small business owners frustrated by bloated government regulations, and with working Americans who saw fiscal responsibility not as a cold calculation, but as a necessary step toward long-term stability. No longer were the budget reforms seen as reckless cuts. They were now viewed as the path forward, a responsible recalibration to ensure that the nation did not collapse under the weight of uncontrolled spending. As the tides turned, political pressure mounted in Congress. Democrats, who had once been adamantly opposed to any cuts or restructuring, found themselves in a difficult position. They could no longer ignore the public demand for reform. Their usual playbook of resistance and obstruction was no longer viable. Voters were watching closely, and for the first time in years, they were demanding accountability. The party leadership was forced to the negotiating table, their defiance tempered by the realization that refusing to engage would come at a political cost. In the end, after weeks of fierce debates, strategic compromises, and high-stakes negotiations, Congress passed a revised budget that incorporated many of the Republican proposals. While some reductions in spending were made, they were carefully targeted, focused on trimming waste and inefficiencies rather than gutting essential services. At the same time, the budget included key investments in infrastructure and job training, ensuring that the American workforce remained competitive in an evolving economy. Crucially, Medicare remained untouched. The Democratic Fear campaign, which had painted Republicans as eager to dismantle the program, was ultimately exposed as baseless. The final budget ensured that Medicare was protected, strengthened through smarter spending rather than reckless expansion. The issue that had been the central battleground of the debate had been won decisively by the Republican leadership. Meanwhile, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, underwent necessary reforms. Rather than the unchecked expansions that had led to inefficiencies and fraud, the new budget streamlined the system, ensuring that aid was directed toward those who truly needed it while eliminating loopholes that had allowed waste and abuse. The restructuring made the program more effective, proving that government assistance could be both compassionate and fiscally responsible. The passage of the budget was more than just a legislative victory. It was a shift in the political landscape. The American people had seen firsthand that responsible governance was possible, that fiscal discipline did not mean abandoning the vulnerable, and that leadership meant making the tough choices necessary for the future. The narrative had changed. The left's rhetoric had been exposed, and in its place, a new message had taken hold. America was moving forward, stronger and more financially secure than before. News of the budget approval sent waves of celebration through the White House. In the West Wing, advisors, staffers, and key members of the administration exchanged handshakes, congratulatory nods, and triumphant smiles. It had been a hard-fought battle, waged not just in Congress but in the court of public opinion, and they had emerged victorious. The months of strategic messaging, countering Democratic fear-mongering, and presenting a bold, responsible vision for the future had paid off. The American people had not only heard their message, but embraced it. In the Oval Office, President Trump stood at the center of his team, a broad grin stretching across his face. The energy in the room was electric. He clasped Chip Roy on the shoulder, shook hands with Caroline Leavitt, and nodded approvingly at Elon Musk, whose unconventional communication strategies had played a pivotal role in the public shift. "We did it," Trump declared, his voice filled with unmistakable pride. "We told the truth, and the American people listened." The victory was not just political, it was symbolic. It was a testament to the power of truth, the effectiveness of direct and compelling communication, and the undeniable influence of a leader willing to stand firm in the face of relentless opposition. The narrative had changed, not because of manipulation, but because the facts had been laid bare in a way that resonated with everyday Americans. Trump and his team had exposed the flaws in Omar's deceitful messaging, dismantled the hysteria surrounding the proposed cuts, and proven that fiscal responsibility did not equate to cruelty. The shadow of fear and misinformation had been lifted, replaced by the bright promise of a stronger, more financially secure nation. The media, even some of its more left-leaning outlets, begrudgingly acknowledged the shift. The Republican leadership had navigated the issue with discipline, avoiding the pitfalls of past budget fights that had cost them politically. Instead of playing into the Democrats' caricature of heartless conservatism, they had framed themselves as problem solvers, leaders who sought to safeguard America's economic future rather than recklessly spend its resources into oblivion. The message had stuck. The people trusted him, and he had delivered. Trump leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. This wasn't just about passing a budget, this was proof. Proof that America was ready for leadership that didn't cave under pressure. Proof that fiscal responsibility could be embraced rather than feared. Proof that his movement was not just alive, but thriving. The battle had been won, but he knew the war for America's future was far from over.